I didn't drop the coffee cup because that would have been too cinematic, too wasteful, and honestly beneath someone who deals with corporate crises for a living. Instead, I stood there at 6:17 in the morning, staring at my wife's iPhone screen, glowing on our marble countertop, reading what felt like the autopsy report of our marriage, while she hummed in the shower upstairs. The message from Brock, dealership, burned into my retinas. Can't wait to feel you again. Today at the Grand Hyatt, room 412. Wear that red lingerie I love, and don't forget the perfume that idiot bought you. That idiot was me, Ethan Caldwell, 42 years old, senior crisis management consultant at one of Seattle's top firms. The guy companies call when they need someone to identify weaknesses and eliminate them without mercy. The irony wasn't lost on me that the biggest security breach in my life had been eating breakfast across from me for the past 10 years, smiling while she planned her exit strategy using my credit cards and my trust as collateral. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not pain exactly, more like the moment right before you execute a perfectly planned corporate takeover, that crystalline clarity where emotion becomes irrelevant and strategy becomes everything. I took a photo of her screen with my phone, placed her device back at the exact angle I'd found it, and sipped my black coffee while my brain started running calculations on asset protection, evidence collection, and the surgical dismantling of the woman who thought she could play me for a fool. When Sarah walked into the kitchen 15 minutes later, wrapped in her silk robe with her hair still damp and smelling like lies mixed with expensive body wash, I smiled at her with the same poker face I used during hostile negotiations. She kissed my cheek and started talking about her late meeting with clients from New York, while I nodded along, already mentally cataloging our joint accounts, shared properties, and the prenuptial agreement she'd signed a decade ago when she was too in love to read the fine print. She had no idea that the man making her coffee and asking about her day had already started the countdown to her complete destruction, that every word coming out of her mouth was being recorded not by my ears, but by my tactical brain that was 3 steps ahead of her amateur hour affair. I watched her drive away in the white Mercedes I'd bought her last year, and the moment those gates closed behind her, I didn't cry or punch walls or do any of the dramatic things you see in movies about betrayed husbands. I went to war. The drive to my office took 20 minutes through typical Seattle drizzle, but my mind was already running multiple scenarios simultaneously, calculating every possible move and countermove like the chess game this had become. I locked my office door, pulled the blinds, and made 3 phone calls that would change everything. First to Jake in our cybersecurity division, a former NSA analyst who owed me for getting his sister's DUI charges reduced. Second to Marcus in financial forensics, who could trace money through corporate shells better than the IRS. And third to David Brennan, my attorney and the most ruthless divorce lawyer in Washington state, who'd once left a cheating spouse so broke, she had to move back in with her parents at age 45. I didn't tell them I was hurt or betrayed or any of that victim mentality garbage, because that's not how you win these situations. You win by treating it like a hostile corporate takeover, where emotions are liabilities and cold calculation is the only currency that matters. By noon, I had a complete financial autopsy of my marriage spread across 3 monitors in my office. And it was worse than I'd imagined. So much worse that I actually had to stand up and pace to process the sheer scope of her deception. This wasn't just an affair. This was systematic financial fraud orchestrated by someone I'd trusted with access to everything. Sarah hadn't just been sleeping with Brock Miller, the former college quarterback turned car dealership manager who ran his wife's business, while pretending he was some alpha male entrepreneur. She'd been funding his entire lifestyle with our money. The bank statements told a story that made my jaw clench. Luxury hotels charging $400 a night, dinners at Daniel's Steakhouse for $300 a pop, a Breitling watch for $8,000 that she'd claimed was a business gift for a client, and most damning of all, a hidden account she'd named Freedom Fund with $45,000 siphoned from our joint savings over the past 8 months. She'd been planning her escape, building her little nest egg, probably fantasizing about running away with her quarterback, while I paid for everything like some oblivious ATM machine. The emails Marcus recovered from her cloud backup were even more illuminating. Conversations where she called me boring but useful and told Brock about how I was too focused on work to notice anything, and how she deserved passion after being stuck with a robot for 10 years. Every line felt like she was betting against me, assuming I was too stupid or too trusting to ever catch on, and that fundamental miscalculation was going to cost her everything she had and more. I felt my anger crystallize into something pure and focused, that liquid nitrogen cold that comes when you realize someone has violated not just your trust, but the basic terms of your contract. And in my world, contract violations come with severe penalties. Jake came through with something beautiful: complete access to her text messages, emails, and location data for the past year, all obtained through methods that would never hold up in court, but would absolutely destroy her in the court of public opinion. I watched her digital life unfold like a map of betrayal, every hotel check-in, every afternoon dentist appointment that was actually a 3-hour session at the Grand Hyatt, every lie she told me about working late that was really her in some bar with Brock pretending to be single. There were photos too, ones they'd taken in mirrors and hotel rooms, her wearing lingerie I'd bought her for our anniversary, him with his shirt off, showing the kind of body that comes from genetics rather than hard work. Both of them looking stupidly happy in that temporary way that affairs always are before reality catches up. But what caught my attention most was a series of emails about Brock's financial troubles, how his wife, Victoria, was always on his case about money, and how he needed to find new revenue streams to maintain his lifestyle. That's when I understood the full picture. Brock wasn't just sleeping with my wife. He was using her as a bank to cover his failing schemes and expensive habits. And she was too blinded by mediocre sex and the fantasy of being with a real man to see she was being played just as much as I was. The irony was delicious: the scammer getting scammed, the cheater getting cheated, and I was going to make sure they both paid the full price for their stupidity. I called David back and told him to start drafting divorce papers with one specific clause activated: the adultery provision in our prenuptial agreement that would leave Sarah with exactly nothing if I could prove infidelity, which I absolutely could with the mountain of evidence currently filling my hard drives. But I wasn't satisfied with just winning legally. I wanted total victory, the kind where your opponent doesn't just lose, but understands exactly how and why they lost and how they'll never recover from it. That's when I decided to reach out to Victoria Miller. Getting an appointment with an assistant district attorney isn't easy, but I had leverage in the form of a case I'd consulted on 6 months ago involving corporate fraud that had made her look very good in the press. I called in that favor and found myself in her office at 4:30 that afternoon, facing a woman who looked like she'd been carved from ice and disappointment. Victoria Miller was 40 years old, rail thin in that way that comes from stress rather than yoga, with short dark hair and eyes that had probably stopped believing in fairy tales around the same time she realized she'd married a man-child. She looked at me with the kind of professional skepticism prosecutors develop after years of listening to people lie, and I respected that because I was about to give her something she wouldn't expect: the complete and documented truth about her husband's betrayal and criminal activity. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or play the sympathetic spouse card, because that would have insulted both of us. I placed a manila folder on her desk and said in the same tone I use for hostile board meetings, "Your husband is sleeping with my wife, but that's not the real problem here. The real problem is that he's been using funds from your automotive business and my family accounts to run what appears to be a money laundering operation through his dealership service department." I watched her face carefully as she opened the folder, saw the progression from surprise to fury to that cold professional mask that meant she was already calculating her next move. The documents Jake had pulled showed Brock accepting cash payments for vehicle services, reporting lower amounts to the IRS, and pocketing the difference, a classic scheme that morons always think they're the first to invent. He'd also been using a company card Victoria had given him for business expenses to pay for hotel rooms and gifts for Sarah, which meant he was not only cheating on his wife, but stealing from her business to do it. Victoria read through everything twice, her jaw getting tighter with each page, and when she finally looked up at me, I saw something I recognized because I felt it too. That moment when betrayal transforms from emotion into strategy. She asked in a voice that could cut glass, "What do you want from me, Ethan?" And I gave her the answer I'd been preparing since I walked in. I'm going to destroy Sarah financially and socially, and you're going to destroy Brock legally and professionally, and we're not going to get in each other's way while we do it. She didn't even hesitate before extending her hand, and her grip was firmer than most men I'd done business with, strong enough to leave marks and seal deals that couldn't be broken. We spent the next hour coordinating our separate campaigns, sharing information about bank accounts and hotel records and text messages, building parallel cases that would hit both targets simultaneously and prevent them from warning each other or mounting any kind of defense. Victoria told me something that made me smile despite everything. Brock had been planning to leave her once he'd squeezed enough money out of Sarah, probably figuring he could jump from one meal ticket to another like some kind of professional parasite. The idea that he thought he could manage that transition without getting caught showed the kind of arrogance that comes from a lifetime of getting by on looks and charm rather than actual intelligence. We agreed to move simultaneously in 3 days, giving me time to finish my evidence collection and her time to coordinate with the financial crimes unit she worked with. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the satisfaction of a perfectly planned operation about to execute, where all the pieces were in place and all the exits were covered, and the targets had no idea what was coming for them. The next 3 days were torture in the best possible way. I had to pretend everything was normal while Sarah continued her affair and her lies, coming home from her business meetings, smelling like hotel soap and telling me about fictional clients with fictional problems. I played along perfectly, asking questions about her made-up day, laughing at her manufactured stories, all while my phone was recording every word for the eventual legal proceedings. I even bought her flowers on Tuesday, expensive roses that made her smile and say, "I was being so sweet lately," not realizing that every kindness was another entry in the ledger of her betrayal that would make the eventual revelation that much more devastating. I watched her text Brock from the bathroom, heard her laugh at whatever stupid thing he'd said, saw her apply the perfume I'd bought her before going to meet him on Wednesday afternoon while supposedly visiting her mother in Tacoma. Every moment she thought she was getting away with it made the trap that much tighter, and I savored it the way you savor a perfectly aged scotch, slowly and with full appreciation for all the complex notes involved. On Wednesday night, she came home glowing and relaxed in that way women do after spending the afternoon in bed with their boyfriends, and she actually had the nerve to initiate sex with me, probably trying to cover her tracks or assuage whatever microscopic guilt she might have felt. I declined, claiming exhaustion from work, and watched her shrug and go to sleep like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter, like our entire marriage was just convenient scenery for her real life that was happening somewhere else. That's when I knew I'd made the right call going scorched earth, because she didn't just betray me, she'd stopped seeing me as human, just a useful appliance that paid bills and provided cover for her actual existence. Thursday morning, I told her I had a business trip to Portland and would be gone for 2 days. She tried hard not to look too excited, asking if I needed her to drive me to the airport, offering to pack my bag, all while probably already planning how she'd spend both nights at the Grand Hyatt with Brock now that I'd be out of town. I could practically see her mental calculations, figuring she could tell him I was away, and they could have romantic dinners and wake up together like they were a real couple with a real relationship, instead of two cheaters living in a fantasy that was about to implode. I made a big show of packing, kissed her goodbye at 6 in the morning, drove to the airport, and then circled back to a hotel near our house where I spent the day coordinating final details with David, Victoria, and the team of specialists I'd assembled for this operation. At 2 in the afternoon, Victoria's people hit Brock's dealership with a search warrant for financial records related to tax fraud and money laundering. At 2:15, David filed divorce papers at the courthouse with accompanying motions to freeze all joint accounts. At 2:30, I sent an encrypted email to Sarah's boss that included carefully selected evidence of her using company resources for personal affairs, not mentioning the infidelity, but focusing on the credit card receipts and timesheet discrepancies that showed she'd been billing the company for hours she'd spent in hotels with Brock. The beauty of the timing was that it all happened simultaneously, so none of them had time to warn the others or coordinate any kind of response. They were all too busy dealing with their own individual crises to realize this was a coordinated attack. I sat in that hotel room watching the chaos unfold through a combination of news alerts, text messages from my sources, and the sheer satisfaction of a plan coming together flawlessly. Victoria called me at 3 to confirm that Brock was in custody for questioning and his accounts were frozen pending investigation. David texted at 3:20 to confirm all joint accounts were locked and Sarah's credit cards were canceled. And at 4:15, I got a call from an old college friend who worked in Sarah's building security, telling me she'd been escorted out by HR with a box of her personal belongings and a letter terminating her employment pending internal review. Everything was burning down around them exactly as I'd planned. And I hadn't even gotten to the best part yet. I drove home slowly, getting there around 6:30, knowing Sarah would arrive shortly after me in whatever state of panic and confusion she'd managed to work herself into. I parked in the garage, went inside, poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, and sat in the leather chair in our living room with all the lights off except one lamp that created the kind of dramatic shadows you'd see in a film noir. I didn't turn on my phone or check messages because I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was happening and exactly how this was going to play out. Like a chess player who sees checkmate 15 moves ahead and is just enjoying watching the opponent realize their position is hopeless. At 6:45, I heard her key in the lock, heard her high heels clicking on the marble floor of our entryway, heard her calling out, "Honey, I'm home," in that fake cheerful voice she used when she was lying. She appeared in the doorway of the living room, wearing the black cocktail dress I'd bought her for our anniversary, the diamond necklace I'd given her last Christmas, looking stunning and poisonous, like a beautiful snake that didn't realize it had already been defanged. She stopped when she saw me sitting there in the dark, confusion crossing her face because I should have been in Portland, because her carefully constructed reality was already starting to crack at the edges. "You didn't leave?" she said, her voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "Trip canceled," I replied without raising my voice, without any emotion at all, just stating a simple fact. "What trip?" she asked, still playing innocent, still thinking she could talk her way through this. "Room 412 at the Grand Hyatt, and dinner with Brock, and your entire future. Everything's canceled, Sarah." I watched the color drain from her face so fast you could actually see it happening. Watched her hand reach instinctively for her purse, where her phone should have provided some kind of lifeline. She pulled it out and stared at the screen that said "Service Suspended," her fingers moving frantically over buttons that no longer responded to her commands. "Don't bother," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a knife through paper. "Your phone's been remotely disabled, along with your credit cards, your access to our accounts, and your ability to contact anyone who might help you. You're bankrupt, Sarah, financially, professionally, and soon socially. Now sit down." She tried denial first, saying it wasn't what it looked like, that Brock was just a friend who understood her in ways I never did, that they mostly talked about life and feelings, and nothing physical had really happened. I let her finish her pathetic performance before I pulled out my phone and airplayed dozens of photos to our television. Her and Brock kissing in hotel hallways, restaurant receipts for meals they'd shared, text messages where she described in explicit detail what she wanted to do to him, bank statements showing $45,000 transferred to an account I'd never authorized. Each image was like a blow, and I watched her deflate with every swipe, watched her realize that I had documented everything, that there was no way to lie or spin or minimize what she'd done. "You stole $45,000 from our family," I said in the same tone I'd used to read a quarterly earnings report. "You invested it in a loser who lives off his wife's success while pretending to be some kind of entrepreneur. By the way, Victoria Miller says hello. Right now, police are searching Brock's dealership for evidence of money laundering, and his accounts are frozen pending criminal investigation." She started shaking then, not from cold, but from the realization that this wasn't a fight or a confrontation. This was an execution, and she was already dead. She just hadn't stopped moving yet. I stood up and walked toward her until I was close enough to see the mascara starting to run down her cheeks, close enough to smell that expensive perfume I'd bought her that she'd worn to meet another man. "Now take off the necklace," I said quietly. "What?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "The necklace, the earrings, the watch, and that dress. Everything you're wearing was purchased with my money, and you violated the terms of our partnership. I'm reclaiming my assets." She stood there looking at me like I'd lost my mind, but I hadn't lost anything except illusions. And I wanted her to understand that every single thing she'd taken for granted was being revoked right now in real time. This wasn't about sex or power or any of that psychological complexity people assign to moments like this. It was about property rights and contract law, and making sure she understood that nothing she had was really hers. It had all been borrowed and the loan had just been called. She removed the jewelry with shaking hands, slipped out of the dress she'd worn to meet her lover, stood there in her underwear holding a pile of expensive items that no longer belonged to her while tears ran down her face and her whole body trembled with the understanding of how completely she'd miscalculated. "You're cruel," she managed to say through her crying. "No, Sarah, I'm fair, and that's much worse." I let her stand there another minute before telling her to go upstairs and put on regular clothes, that we weren't done with this conversation, but I wasn't going to continue it while she was dressed like she was going to seduce someone. She fled to the guest room, not our bedroom, because she understood instinctively that she no longer had access to that space. And I heard her sobbing through the door while I calmly sent messages to David, confirming the next phases of our plan. 20 minutes later, she came back down wearing jeans and a sweater, her face blotchy and swollen, looking like a stranger in a house she'd lived in for a decade. I explained the situation to her in clear, simple terms that even someone in shock could understand. She would sign away all rights to our joint property in exchange for me not pressing criminal charges for the theft of marital funds. She would accept full responsibility for the affair in our divorce filing, triggering the adultery clause in our prenup that gave her exactly nothing from our 10-year marriage. She would vacate the house within 7 days and take only personal items that she'd brought into the marriage or that I specifically designated as hers. Any attempt to contest these terms would result in me pursuing criminal prosecution, providing evidence to the media, and ensuring she never worked in Seattle again. I laid it all out like a business proposal because that's what it was. A transaction where she would trade her pride and her rights for the mercy of not going to prison. She tried to argue, saying she'd get a lawyer, that no judge would allow this, that she had rights under Washington state community property law. I pulled out a copy of the prenup she'd signed after 3 glasses of champagne at our engagement party, the one my lawyer had written specifically to protect against exactly this scenario, and watched her read through provisions she'd never bothered to examine when she'd been young and in love and certain that nothing bad would ever happen to us. Section 14.3 was beautifully clear. Documented infidelity voided all claims to assets acquired during marriage, with additional penalties if said infidelity involved the misappropriation of marital funds. She'd signed it, initialed every page, even had her own lawyer review it, and now it was going to be the instrument of her complete destruction. "But I'll have nothing," she said, the reality finally sinking in. "No job, no money, no house." "You'll have your freedom," I replied, "which is apparently what you wanted all along. The only difference is you thought you'd get it while keeping my money and my house and my reputation. Now you get it while keeping exactly what you contributed to this marriage, which was nothing." She spent that night in the guest room, and I slept better than I had in months knowing that the source of my stress and betrayal was contained, that the problem had been identified and was being systematically eliminated. The next morning, I allowed her to go into our bedroom to gather personal items while I supervised, making sure she didn't take anything that wasn't explicitly hers or that had been purchased with shared funds. She packed 2 suitcases with clothes and toiletries, tried to take some jewelry that I reminded her came from me, attempted to claim a laptop that was registered to my company. Every attempt to grab something that wasn't hers was another small lesson in how completely she'd lost, how thoroughly she'd gambled and failed. While she packed, I went ahead with the social destruction phase of my plan. I didn't post anything on social media or send out mass emails. That would have been crass and beneath someone of my position. Instead, I simply showed up at the country club for our regular Thursday poker game, and when someone asked where Sarah was, I paused, looked at my cards, and said in a conversational tone that carried perfectly in the quiet room, "Sarah decided that investing in aging quarterbacks was more worthwhile than investing in our family. Unfortunately, she used my money and my trust to fund that decision." That was all it took, 5 seconds of carefully chosen words, and the information spread through our social circle faster than any press release could have managed. By the end of the evening, my phone was full of messages from friends and business associates expressing shock and support, while Sarah's phone, once she got service restored, was probably full of silence as every person she'd counted on for social capital decided she was too toxic to associate with. I'd effectively made her radioactive in Seattle society, not through lies or exaggeration, but through simple truth delivered at the right time to the right audience. The women in her yoga class stopped returning texts. Her supposed best friend Lauren canceled their standing lunch date indefinitely. The invitations to charity galas and fundraising events that used to fill her calendar dried up instantly because no one wanted to be photographed next to the woman who'd betrayed Ethan Caldwell and gotten caught so spectacularly. Social death is slower than physical death, but just as permanent in circles like ours. And I watched it happen to her with the same clinical interest I'd apply to any successful business strategy. The real entertainment came when Brock Miller showed up at my office building 3 days later, looking like a man whose entire world had collapsed around him, because that's exactly what had happened. Victoria had filed for divorce and seized all joint assets, including the automotive business that was actually hers anyway. The police investigation had uncovered not just financial fraud, but also evidence of cocaine use and distribution through his dealership's service department. His reputation was destroyed, his income was gone, his wife had cut him off completely, and he'd somehow convinced himself that this was all my fault rather than the natural consequence of his own stupidity and greed. He caught me in the parking garage around 7 in the evening when most people had gone home, probably thinking the isolated location would intimidate me or give him some kind of advantage. He was 6'3" and probably weighed 220, all of it the kind of muscle that comes from genetics rather than discipline. And he clearly thought his size would make up for the fact that I'd outmaneuvered him at every turn. He came at me screaming about how I'd destroyed his life, how I'd turned his wife against him, how I'd ruined everything he'd built, which was hilarious considering he'd built exactly nothing and had been living off Victoria's success for his entire adult life. "You rat in a suit," he yelled, his face red with impotent rage. "You set me up with Victoria." He swung at me, a wide telegraphed haymaker that might have worked on drunk college kids 20 years ago, but was laughably easy to avoid for someone who'd been training in boxing 4 times a week for the past 5 years. I slipped his punch, stepped inside his guard, and drove a short hook into his liver with enough force to remind him that size means nothing without technique. He folded like a cheap lawn chair, gasping for breath on the oil-stained concrete, while I calmly adjusted my cufflinks and looked down at him with the kind of contempt you reserve for insects that have wandered where they don't belong. "You played adult games, boy," I said, crouching next to his gasping form. "You reached into the wrong man's pocket. If you come near me or my property again, I'll make sure you go to prison not for fraud, but for something much worse. I know where you keep your powder, Brock, and I know exactly who you've been selling it to." That was a bluff. I hadn't actually found evidence of him dealing drugs, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. His eyes went wide with fear, and his mouth opened like he wanted to deny it, but couldn't get the words out past his panicked breathing. The alpha male act evaporated instantly, replaced by the coward underneath who'd always been there, who'd never faced real consequences for anything and suddenly realized he was in over his head. I left him lying there next to my Lexus, defeated and pathetic, while I drove home listening to Mozart and feeling absolutely nothing about the encounter except satisfaction that another problem had been efficiently solved. The final week Sarah spent in what used to be our house was designed specifically to break her remaining will to resist. I let her stay in the guest room while David prepared the final paperwork, and during that time I went about my life as if she didn't exist. I went for morning runs at 6, made breakfast in the kitchen while she hid upstairs, took work calls in my home office, had drinks with colleagues after work, and basically demonstrated that her presence or absence made no difference whatsoever to my happiness or routine. It's a psychological technique they use in hostage negotiations called strategic indifference, where you show the other party that they have zero leverage because you genuinely don't care whether they cooperate or not. And it's devastatingly effective on people whose entire sense of self-worth depends on being desired or needed. She tried everything during that week, every manipulation tactic in the book. She cooked elaborate dinners that I ate while reading newspapers and answering emails. She wore revealing clothes that I didn't even glance at because I'd already recategorized her in my mind from wife to pending liability that needed processing. She tried crying at strategic times, hoping for sympathy. She tried anger, hoping for engagement. She even tried seduction one desperate night when she appeared in my bedroom doorway wearing lingerie I hadn't bought her, which meant Brock had purchased it, which meant she was trying to seduce me while wearing another man's gift, which was so pathetically miscalculated that I just stared at her until she left without saying a word. But the worst torture for her, I think, was hearing me laugh during phone conversations with friends, hearing me plan future trips and business deals, hearing me live a life that was getting better without her in it. She'd probably imagined I'd be devastated, that I'd beg her to stay, that her leaving would destroy me somehow. But instead, she was watching me thrive while she circled the drain. On day 5, she tried to appeal to our shared history, reminding me of our wedding day and our first apartment and trips we'd taken together, all the usual emotional blackmail that people attempt when they realize they've made a catastrophic mistake. I let her finish her little speech before responding with a simple question that shut down that line of attack forever. If those memories meant so much to you, why did you steal from me and sleep with a man you clearly didn't even respect? She didn't have an answer because there wasn't one. Just rationalizations and self-serving narratives about deserving happiness and feeling disconnected, and all the standard excuses that cheaters tell themselves to avoid accepting responsibility for their choices. I didn't argue with her or try to change her mind because I didn't care what she believed about her own motivations. I only cared about the facts, which were that she'd violated a contract and would now face the contractually specified penalties. By day 6, she'd stopped trying to engage me at all, just moved through the house like a ghost collecting the few possessions she was allowed to keep, her movements getting smaller and quieter as the reality of her situation became undeniable. The final night arrived with the typical Seattle rain that had started around noon and showed no signs of stopping. I'd had her pack suitcases placed on the porch while she was in the shower, a not-so-subtle signal that her time in this house was finished and she needed to accept that and move on. When she came downstairs at 8 in the evening, wearing jeans and a simple jacket, the only clothes she had left that weren't designer items I'd purchased, she found me standing in the foyer with the signed divorce agreement in my hand and zero expression on my face. She looked at the open front door, at her suitcases getting soaked on the porch, at me blocking her path to anything she might want to take with her, and I saw the moment she finally understood that this wasn't negotiable, that there would be no last-minute reprieve or romantic reconciliation or anything except her walking out that door into whatever life she'd earned through her choices. "Ethan, I have nowhere to go," she said, and I heard genuine panic in her voice for the first time. "My mother said she's ashamed of me. Brock is under investigation. I don't have enough money for even a cheap motel room." I looked at her without any sympathy or anger, just the clinical assessment you'd give a failed project that needed to be closed out and archived. She was 35 years old, college-educated, physically healthy, and had spent the past decade living off my success while contributing nothing except liabilities and problems I was still cleaning up. The idea that she expected me to feel sorry for her now, after everything she'd done and every choice she'd made, was almost insulting enough to make me laugh. "You're 35, Sarah. You have working hands and working legs. Welcome to the real world where actions have consequences and sympathy isn't a currency anyone accepts anymore." "Will you ever forgive me?" she asked, and I heard hope in her voice, like she still believed there was some future scenario where this all got resolved and we went back to normal. "No," I said, and I let that word hang there for a few seconds before continuing. "I'll forget you. That's much worse." I closed the heavy oak door before she could respond, heard the lock click with a satisfying finality that marked the end of this chapter in my life. Through the thick wood, I could hear her screaming my name, could hear her crying and pounding on the door, but the sound was muffled and distant, like something happening in another dimension that had nothing to do with me anymore. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and looked around at the quiet, empty house that finally felt clean for the first time in months. The marble countertops were clear, the furniture was mine. The air itself seemed lighter without the weight of her presence and her lies. I sat at the breakfast bar where I'd discovered her betrayal, pulled out my phone and deleted her contact information, blocked her number, removed her from my emergency contacts and my life insurance beneficiaries, and every other digital connection that had tied us together. By the time I finished my water, the crying outside had stopped and I heard a car pull up, probably a rideshare she'd called on, whatever phone service she'd managed to restore, or borrowed from someone still willing to talk to her. I heard her suitcases being loaded, heard the car drive away, and then there was nothing but silence and rain and the profound satisfaction of a problem solved completely and permanently. I went upstairs to my bedroom, the master bedroom that was mine alone now, and slept for 9 straight hours without waking once. The deep, dreamless sleep of someone who'd completed a difficult task and had nothing left to regret or worry about. The next morning, I woke up at 6 as usual, went for my run through the wet Seattle streets, came home to a house that felt twice as large and infinitely more peaceful, and started making plans for the next phase of my life. I had David begin the process of removing Sarah's name from every document and deed and account we'd ever shared. I called a designer about remodeling the master bedroom because I didn't want to sleep in a space that had any memory of her in it. I scheduled dinners with 3 different women I'd met through business connections over the years. Attractive, successful women who'd indicated interest before I was married and who I'd politely declined at the time. I wasn't interested in a relationship yet, possibly never would be again. But I was interested in reminding myself that there was an entire world of options out there now, that I wasn't tied to someone who'd seen me as nothing more than a convenient bank account and source of stability. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later with Sarah signing every document without contest, because David had made it very clear that resistance would only make things worse and potentially criminal. She got to keep her personal items, her car that had been in her name before we married, and exactly nothing else. I got the house, the investments, the retirement accounts, the vacation property in Bend, and my reputation intact because everyone who mattered knew that I'd been the wrong party and had handled it with ruthless efficiency. Victoria Miller sent me a bottle of very expensive scotch with a note that said simply, "Justice served. Thank you for your assistance," which I took to mean that Brock's legal troubles had resulted in convictions that would keep him occupied for the next 3 to 5 years. Sarah moved to Portland according to mutual acquaintances who still occasionally brought her up in conversation before quickly changing the subject when they remembered I didn't discuss her anymore. She was working as a sales associate at a furniture store, living in a studio apartment, driving a car that was 10 years old and had over 100,000 miles on it. Her social media, which I checked exactly once out of idle curiosity, showed a woman who looked 10 years older than she was, posting inspirational quotes about fresh starts and learning from mistakes, the digital equivalent of whistling past a graveyard. I felt nothing looking at those photos, no satisfaction and no regret, just the mild interest you might feel watching a documentary about extinct animals that once roamed the earth but were now gone and irrelevant. I rebuilt my life methodically and without hurry, treating it like any other project that required careful planning and execution. I renovated the house room by room, erasing every trace of our shared history and replacing it with spaces that reflected only my preferences and my future. I took up sailing, something I'd always wanted to do, but Sarah had complained was boring and found I had a natural talent for reading winds and tides. I established new routines with new people, joined a different country club where nobody knew my marriage history, started attending cultural events and charity functions where I was simply Ethan Caldwell, the successful consultant, rather than Ethan Caldwell, the man whose wife had cheated on him. Within 6 months, the story had been absorbed into Seattle's collective memory as just another cautionary tale about greed and stupidity. And within a year, most people had forgotten it entirely, which was exactly what I wanted. I never contacted Sarah again, never drove past her old workplace, never asked anyone about her life after she left. She'd become what I'd promised she would become, completely forgotten, a closed file in a cabinet I never opened, a problem that had been solved and required no further attention. The anger I'd felt that morning reading her text messages had been processed and converted into action, and once the action was complete, there was nothing left to feel. Some men would probably say I should forgive her, or at least understand that people make mistakes, and relationships are complicated. But those men have never had someone systematically steal from them while laughing about how stupid they are for not noticing. They've never had to rebuild their sense of trust from absolute zero, never had to accept that someone they'd chosen to build a life with had seen them as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. 3 years later, I remarried, this time to a woman named Catherine who ran her own architectural firm and had a prenup ready before I even brought up the subject. We had a small ceremony with 50 guests, bought a different house together that had no history for either of us, and built a relationship based on honest communication and complete transparency about finances, expectations, and what we would and wouldn't tolerate from each other. She knew about Sarah. I'd told her the whole story on our third date because I believe in radical honesty after you've been burned by lies. And her response had been to nod and say, "That's what happens when people underestimate consequences." We've been happy together in the calm, stable way that comes from two people who both lived through chaos and decided they prefer boring reliability over dramatic passion. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that morning in the kitchen reading Sarah's messages, about the cold clarity that had descended on me in that moment, about how I'd transformed hurt into strategy and emotion into tactics. I think about the choice I'd made to go scorched earth instead of trying to work it out or forgive her or any of the other options that weaker men might have chosen. I don't regret it, not for a second, because she'd violated the fundamental terms of our contract, and in my world, contracts are sacred. You either honor your commitments or you face the penalties. There's no middle ground where you get to betray someone and then negotiate for mercy after you've been caught. People sometimes ask me if I think I was too harsh, if maybe I should have given her a second chance, or tried to understand her perspective, or shown more compassion. I usually just smile and change the subject because there's no point explaining to someone who hasn't lived through systematic betrayal that mercy isn't always a virtue, that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do is let someone avoid the full consequences of their actions, that teaching someone accountability is actually the kindest gift you can give them, even if they hate you for it. Sarah got exactly what she earned through a decade of taking me for granted and 8 months of actively stealing from me, and the fact that she didn't like the result is irrelevant to the justice of it. My life now is clean and organized and free of the kind of chaos that comes from sharing space with someone who sees you as a mark rather than a partner. I wake up every morning in a house that's mine, next to a woman who chose me for who I am rather than what I provide. And I feel that same satisfaction I felt the night Sarah left. The satisfaction of problems solved, of contracts honored, of a system that works exactly as designed when you have the courage to enforce the terms. Some people might call that cold or unforgiving or emotionally damaged, but those people have never had to rebuild their life from the ashes of someone else's betrayal, have never had to look in the mirror and decide whether they're going to be a victim or a victor. I chose victory, and I'd make the same choice again tomorrow without hesitation, because at the end of the day, the only person responsible for protecting your interests is you. And the moment you forget, that is the moment someone like Sarah walks into your life with a smile and a plan to take everything you've built while you sleep. I didn't let that happen. I caught it early. I dealt with it efficiently, and I moved on without looking back. That's not cruelty. That's survival. That's what happens when you underestimate someone who spent their entire career eliminating weaknesses and closing vulnerabilities and turning problems into solutions. That's what happens when you bet against a man who treats life like a chess game and always thinks 15 moves ahead. And that ultimately is what makes me sleep peacefully every night, knowing that when I was tested, when my entire life was threatened by someone I trusted completely, I didn't break or beg or compromise. I executed the plan, I followed through completely, and I emerged on the other side stronger and wiser and completely free. Sarah probably tells herself a different story now, probably believes she was the victim of a cruel man who couldn't forgive one mistake, probably has convinced herself that what happened to her was unfair or disproportionate. But the truth, which she'll never accept, is that she engineered her own destruction through choices that had consequences she was too arrogant to calculate. I was just the mechanism through which those consequences manifested, the force of nature that showed up when she violated natural law. The rain kept falling that night and many nights after, typical Seattle weather that washed streets clean and started everything fresh. I stood by my window watching it fall, feeling nothing about the woman who'd driven away into it, crying, feeling everything about the future that stretched ahead of me clear and unobstructed. The house was quiet, the accounts were clean, the contracts were enforced, and life went on exactly as it should when you refuse to let other people's betrayals define your story. That's the thing about being truly cold when it matters. It's not about lacking emotion. It's about refusing to let emotion cloud your judgment when the stakes are too high for mistakes. It's about understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from someone who proved they never loved you at all, and to do it so completely that they become nothing more than a cautionary tale you occasionally remember when making future decisions about trust. 3 years later, I barely remember what her voice sounded like. Can't recall the exact shade of her eyes without looking at old photos I no longer keep. Have trouble connecting the woman I divorced with the woman I married because they seem like completely different people in my memory. The Sarah who walked down the aisle in white was someone I genuinely loved, but she disappeared long before I discovered her affair, replaced by a stranger who wore her face and used her name, but had nothing inside except greed and selfishness. The woman I destroyed wasn't my wife. She was an imposter who'd stolen my wife's identity. And once I understood that distinction, the path forward became perfectly clear. I don't miss her, don't wonder what she's doing, don't care if she's happy or miserable or somewhere in between. She's nothing to me now, less than nothing actually. Just empty space where a person used to be. And in that emptiness, I built something better, something honest, something that actually reflects who I am rather than who someone else needed me to be. That's the real victory, not the money or the house or the satisfaction of watching her fall, but the freedom that comes from cutting out cancer and replacing it with healthy tissue. Some people would say I'm bitter or damaged or incapable of real intimacy after what happened. But they're wrong because I have a better relationship now than I ever had with Sarah, precisely because I learned to value actions over words and results over promises. Every morning when I wake up, I remember that moment standing in my kitchen reading those messages. Remember the cold clarity that descended. Remember the choice I made to fight back instead of accepting victimhood. It reminds me that I'm capable of protecting myself, that I can survive betrayal and come out stronger. That no one will ever take advantage of me like that again, because I'm always watching, always calculating, always 3 moves ahead of any potential threat. Some people might call that paranoid, but I call it learned wisdom, the kind you only get by going through fire and coming out tempered into something stronger than you were before. Catherine understands this about me, understands that my trust has to be earned and maintained daily, that I'm never going to be the kind of husband who just assumes everything is fine without verification. She doesn't resent it because she has her own boundaries and requirements from her own past experiences. We both bring our scars to the relationship, but we also bring the lessons we learned from getting those scars, and that makes us stronger together than we ever were apart. We don't have the kind of passionate, crazy love that young people think is the height of romance. We have something better, a partnership between 2 equals who respect each other's damage and capabilities, who trust each other because that trust is earned every single day, who know that love without accountability is just another word for enabling someone to hurt you. That's what I learned from Sarah. That's the gift she gave me, even though she'll never understand it. The knowledge that love isn't enough, that passion fades, that promises mean nothing compared to actions, and that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. Some people would say that's a sad lesson, that it means I've lost faith in humanity or relationships or the possibility of genuine connection. But they're wrong, because acknowledging reality isn't the same as being defeated by it. I still believe in love. I just believe in a smarter, more careful kind of love that comes with contracts and boundaries and consequences for betrayal. I still believe in partnership. I just believe in equal partnerships where both parties contribute and both parties are held accountable for their actions. And I still believe in mercy in its proper place and time, which is never at the expense of justice or accountability or protecting yourself from people who've proven they're willing to hurt you. Mercy for Sarah would have meant enabling her to continue stealing from me, continue lying to me, continue building her exit strategy on my dime until she was ready to leave. That's not mercy. That's cowardice disguised as compassion, and I refuse to be that kind of man. The man I am, the man I chose to be when I discovered her betrayal, is someone who faces problems directly, who acts decisively, who protects what's his without apology or hesitation. That man is still here, still vigilant, still ready to do what needs to be done if anyone else makes the mistake of thinking I'm an easy mark. The story ends not with Sarah crying in the rain, but with me 3 years later, successful and happy and free, living proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply surviving and thriving without the person who tried to destroy you. She thought I needed her, that I'd fall apart without her, that she was somehow essential to my happiness and success. She was wrong about all of it, wrong about me, wrong about her own value, wrong about what would happen when she finally pushed me too far. And that wrongness, that fundamental miscalculation, is what cost her everything she had and everything she thought she'd steal from me on her way out the door. I won because I was smarter, colder, more prepared, and more willing to do whatever was necessary to protect what was mine. I won because I understood that life isn't a fairy tale where love conquers all. It's a negotiation where the better strategist wins and the loser gets exactly what they deserve. I won because when the moment came to either be a victim or be a victor, I chose victory without hesitation or remorse. And every morning when I wake up in my clean, honest, well-ordered life, I remember that I won, and that makes everything that happened worth it. Some nights I stand at that same window where I stood watching Sarah leave, looking out at the Seattle rain that never really stops. And I think about all the men who are probably standing at similar windows right now, discovering similar betrayals, facing similar choices about how to respond. If I could tell them anything, it would be this. Don't waste time on pain or grief or trying to understand why someone would do this to you. Channel everything into strategy, into protecting what's yours, into making sure they understand that actions have consequences and betrayal comes with a price they can't afford to pay. Be cold when you need to be. Be ruthless when the situation demands it, and never apologize for refusing to be a victim when someone chose to make you one. That's not cruelty, that's survival. That's not revenge, that's justice. And that's not being unable to forgive. That's being smart enough to know the difference between mercy and weakness. Sarah got what she earned, Brock got what he deserved, and I got my life back stronger and cleaner than it was before. That's how these stories should end, not with reconciliation or forgiveness or any of that therapeutic nonsense about healing and moving forward together. They should end with clear boundaries enforced, with consequences delivered, with victims becoming victors, and betrayers learning that some people refuse to be betrayed without fighting back. The rain falls, the city sleeps, and I stand in my house that's finally mine in every sense of the word, feeling the peace that comes from problems solved and contracts honored and a life rebuilt on honest foundations. This is what winning looks like, not some Hollywood ending with violin music and embrace, but a quiet night alone where you look around at everything you've protected and think simply, I handled that correctly. I made the right choices. I became stronger instead of bitter, careful instead of paranoid, selective instead of cynical. And that's the real ending to this story. Not Sarah crying in the rain, but me standing in the dry warmth of my own space, satisfied and complete and ready for whatever comes next.